Now let's talk about the toxicity of oxygen. Not all microbes can tolerate oxygen because it is in fact toxic. You don't know it because every cell in your body is equipped with enzymes that are constantly managing the damaging effects of oxygen. In fact, what they're actually doing is they're neutralizing toxic forms of oxygen. Not all microbes have that ability. Your cells do that, but not all microbes have that ability. Now, in these 5 test tubes, we have, these show the relationship, the different relationships microbes can have with oxygen. So what you have to know is that in this test tube, there's media. Media is what you grow microbes in. It's got nutrients and stuff that they like to eat in there. And it can be liquid or it can be gelatin-like. It doesn't really matter. And then on the top of the test tube, you just have ambient air, which has, of course, some atmospheric oxygen in it. And that oxygen can diffuse into the media, but only a small degree, right? So you have the least atmospheric oxygen down here and the most atmospheric oxygen up here. So in test tube 1, we have obligate aerobes. Test tube 2, obligate anaerobes. We'll go through each of these in a moment. Test tube 3, facultative anaerobe. Test tube 4, microaerophiles. And test tube 5 are called aerotolerant anaerobes. I will go through each one of them. But I want you to remember 2 things when you're trying to determine what a microbe's relationship is to oxygen. The first thing has to do with what we covered in the metabolism chapter. Do they need to use oxygen to extract energy from food? Another way of saying that is, do they use aerobic respiration to extract energy from food, right? That's what, you use aerobic respiration. You breathe in oxygen, and that helps you extract energy from your food and convert it into ATP so that you can use it for cellular processes. So, first question is, does the microbe need oxygen or not to extract energy from food? Is it aerobic? Does it use aerobic respiration, anaerobic respiration, or fermentation? Those things are all going to, create these different relationships with oxygen. The second thing you need to ask is oxygen toxic? Is oxygen toxic? Because a microbe might not use oxygen, but it could still, so you have this microbe that doesn't need oxygen for respiration. But of the microbes that don't use oxygen, some of them are poisoned by oxygen and some of them aren't. So before we get deeper into this, let's talk a little about why oxygen is toxic to some organisms. Well, what happens is oxygen spontaneously breaks down in the presence of water into highly reactive forms. And these highly reactive forms we call reactive oxygen species. Reactive oxygen species. You can see that here in blue, oxygen and other reactive oxygen species. I will be calling these ROSs for short on things like your homework and tests. ROS, reactive oxygen species. So these are different molecules, very, very small molecules made out of oxygen. So here's atmospheric oxygen. That actually in and of itself is not incredibly toxic. But the problem is when in the presence of water, some of these reactive oxygen species will spontaneously form. It just happens on its own. And it happens even faster in the presence of metabolism. So when an organism is using a metabolic process, whether it's aerobic respiration, anaerobic respiration, these things can happen, especially aerobic respiration, these things can happen more quickly. But it does happen on its own in the presence of water regardless. So you can get superoxide anion. That's it's basically atmospheric oxygen but with an extra electron. You can get peroxide, which has 2 extra electrons. You can get hydroxyl radical. That's the OH minus. But a radical means, when you have a radical, it means there's an unpaired electron. Unpaired electrons are incredibly reactive because they tend to either steal other electrons from other molecules really easily, or they become a part of other molecules really easily. And either one of those are going to damage other molecules. It's going to destroy the molecule, make it into something else. So oxygen. So here's some of these chemical reactions, but I'll just say before I go into this that I don't want you to get overwhelmed. I'm not asking you to memorize these reactive oxygen species. I don't need you to memorize them. I don't need you to know superoxide anion. I don't need you to know peroxide. I don't need you to know hydroxyl radical. I don't need you to know these chemical reactions. I'm going to show them to you. You don't need to memorize them. All I want you to get from this is that in the presence of water, oxygen breaks down into reactive oxygen species, and reactive oxygen species are things like free radicals and hydrogen peroxide, and they wreak havoc in the cell. Okay, so here's an example of what happens here. Here's atmospheric oxygen, and in the presence of water, it can pick up another electron just from the water. It can pick up hydrogens with that to become hydrogen peroxide. So there's a superoxide anion. Here's hydrogen peroxide. It can pick up one electron and one hydrogen to become a hydroxyl radical. That's an OH minus, but it's got this unpaired electron here. So these are the kinds of things that, so these are all extraordinarily reactive, meaning they cause these cascades of chemical reactions. There's free radicals here, meaning molecules with unpaired electrons. They just damage all these other molecules in the cell. And they tend to leave a string of other free radicals behind. Okay, so these are reactive oxygen species. I want to tell you what your cells have. If you didn't have any enzymes to neutralize these reactive oxygen species, your cells would become toxic super quickly. So these reactive oxygen species, these free radicals, they need to be neutralized right away so that they don't just go around destroying the cell. So I do want you to know the names of these enzymes that aerobic organisms use, like you, to neutralize reactive oxygen species. First, there's superoxide dismutase. You don't need to memorize the chemical equation that it conducts. You don't need to memorize the chemical reaction that it conducts. You do need to memorize the name of the enzyme. So you have 3 enzymes that neutralize reactive oxygen species. Superoxide dismutase takes these oxygen-free radicals, adds some hydrogen to them to turn them into hydrogen peroxide and back into atmospheric oxygen again. Catalase and peroxidase then take that hydrogen peroxide, which is still a reactive oxygen species. So this singlet oxygen, this is a reactive oxygen species, and this hydrogen peroxide is also a reactive oxygen species. But the thing is that this hydrogen peroxide can be acted upon by these 2 other enzymes, catalase or peroxidase, to be converted back into harmless molecules like water and oxygen. Okay, so superoxide dismutase takes singlet oxygen and converts it into hydrogen peroxide and atmospheric oxygen. Atmospheric oxygen is harmless on its own. Catalase can take that and peroxidase can take that hydrogen peroxide and convert it into water or water and oxygen. Okay, and those are harmless molecules for the cell. So basically, these free radicals and these reactive oxygen species have been neutralized. So there are organisms out there that don't have these. Any organism that's adapted to living in the presence of oxygen has to have these enzymes to neutralize the reactive oxygen species that are always going to be there when oxygen mixes with water. Okay? It's not the oxygen by itself that's toxic, it's what it breaks down into when it's in water that's toxic. Okay? So any organism that is accustomed to living in the presence of water, in the presence of oxygen, whether that organism lives in the water or not, oxygen is dissolved in the water. Fish are aerobic, they use aerobic respiration. Their gills filter the oxygen that's dissolved in the water so that they can breathe. Okay, so fish, mammals, aerobic bacteria, all of those, even some anaerobic bacteria, if they live in even if they don't use the oxygen, if they live in an oxygen-filled environment, they have to have these or they will die. There are some microbes out there, however, that do not have these enzymes. Those microbes cannot neutralize reactive oxygen species that always form when oxygen is present, and so when oxygen is present, they will be poisoned by the reactive oxygen species and they will die. Right? So those microbes cannot be around oxygen at all. Oxygen is poison for them. All right, so any cell attempting to grow in the presence of oxygen must have enzymes that attack the dangerous forms of oxygen, the reactive oxygen species. Not all cells have these enzymes, however, and that accounts in part for the different levels of oxygen tolerance across different species. So I told you, you have to figure out, 1, whether the microbe uses oxygen or not for respiration, and 2, whether oxygen poisons the microbe or not. So keep those two categories in mind. poisoned by oxygen, oxygen for metabolism. So in test tube 1, I told you that we have obligate aerobes. This is the pattern for an obligate aerobe. You can see that it only grows at the topmost portion of the vial. It will not grow down low. That means it's only growing where oxygen concentration is high. So we call it an obligate aerobe. It must be in the presence of atmospheric oxygen. These are organisms that, yes, use oxygen for aerobic respiration, so they need oxygen to help extract energy from food. And no, they are not poisoned by oxygen because they have those enzymes that we just talked about. They have superoxide dismutase, catalase, peroxidase. Oh, by the way, you find these enzymes in eukaryotes in the peroxisomes. So I've referenced this before when you talked about, when you looked at cell anatomy, especially in eukaryotes. These enzymes you find in the peroxisomes. That's the point of peroxisomes. They carry these enzymes that help neutralize reactive oxygen species. Okay. So that's the sole purpose of those organelles, of that particular organelle. All right, so they're not poisoned by oxygen and they need it for respiration. Test tube 2, obligate anaerobe. It must be in an anaerobic environment, obligate anaerobe. It can only grow where oxygen levels are extremely low. It cannot grow anywhere near the oxygen. It can't grow anywhere near it. So this is an obligate anaerobe. It has to be in an environment that has no oxygen. So this microbe does not need oxygen at all for respiration. It probably uses an anaerobic electron transport chain, so a different kind of oxygen-containing salt like nitrite or sulfite or something. So it does not need atmospheric oxygen to extract energy from food, and it is poisoned by oxygen. That's why it's not even getting close. Oxygen is toxic to it because of those reactive oxygen species. Test tube 3, this is the growth pattern of facultative anaerobes. Facultative anaerobes. Facultative anaerobes don't have to use oxygen for respiration, but they can when it's present. So you can see that this microbe is growing in a higher concentration where oxygen is high. So it grows faster when oxygen is available. It grows slower when oxygen is unavailable. So it doesn't need to use oxygen, but it can grow faster in the presence of oxygen. And why? Well, we talked in the metabolism chapter about how aerobic respiration, an electron transport chain that uses oxygen, is the most efficient way to extract energy from food. The electrons in the food are able to give off more energy towards ATP production when they're being removed from the electron transport chain by oxygen. So this is a growth pattern that you'd see for a microbe like yeast. Yeast is able to use aerobic respiration when oxygen is available. When no oxygen is available, it will use fermentation. Now remember, fermentation provides only two, when you take glycolysis and fermentation together, you only get 2 ATP per glucose as opposed to something like 36 ATP per glucose with aerobic respiration. So their metabolism has to slow way down in the absence of oxygen. They don't have to use it, but they would prefer to. They grow better when oxygen's there, just because aerobic respiration is just the best. So they don't need oxygen, but they can use it though. They prefer to use it. And also they're not poisoned by oxygen because you can see that they have no aversion to it, right? They're growing everywhere in this petri dish. In fact, they prefer oxygen a little bit, okay? So they don't need oxygen, but they can use it for metabolism, and they're not poisoned by it. I'm going to skip 4 for now because it's the weirdest one. 5. Let's go to 5 because 5 and 3 look fairly similar, right? So what's the difference? Well, 5 represents they're called aerotolerant anaerobes. Aerotolerant anaerobes. These microbes, you can see that they're growing throughout the petri dish. They don't have an aversion to oxygen, but they don't cluster around it either. They're totally indifferent to oxygen. The reason is they do not use oxygen for respiration. That means they're either going to be using anaerobic respiration or fermentation. Usually it's going to be anaerobic respiration, but either way, as long as they're not using aerobic respiration, they're probably using anaerobic respiration. So they don't need oxygen for metabolism, and they're also not poisoned by it. So even though they're not using oxygen, they still have these enzymes that neutralize those reactive oxygen species, so they're safe. Okay, so they're totally indifferent, not poisoned by it, but also don't use it. So those are aerotolerant anaerobes. Test tube 4. We have what's called microaerophiles. Microaerophiles. This is a really crappy position to be in. If you're a microbe, there aren't very many examples of these out there, and it's very sad because these microbes, they need oxygen for metabolism. They have an aerobic electron transport chain that requires oxygen, and yet they're poisoned by it. So they need it, but they're poisoned by it because they don't have those enzymes that neutralize it. That neutralize reactive oxygen species. So you'll see that they grow in this cluster that represents this very narrow, this very narrow band in which they can grow, where oxygen levels are high enough that they have some oxygen for their electron transport chain, but oxygen levels are also low enough that they're not toxified immediately by it. So they have to grow in low oxygen conditions. Specifically, they're not very tolerant to oxygen even though they need it. So that's what makes 4 different from 1. 1 needs oxygen and is not poisoned by it, so just gets as close to oxygen as it can. 4 needs oxygen but is poisoned by it, so it has to back off from it a little bit. Okay, but it can't back off from it completely because it still needs it. So it can't be like those in test tube 2. It can't be like the obligate anaerobes. So in 1, we have an aerobic electron transport chain. And 2, we have an anaerobic electron transport chain. In 3, we have fermentation alternating with an aerobic electron transport chain, depending on whether oxygen is available or not. 4, we have an aerobic electron transport chain. 5, we likely have an anaerobic electron transport chain.